And I'm very pleased that I can share this panel on withstanding the pressure, resilience, and self-assertion in times of discrimination. We have 3 speakers, or to be more precise, we have 4 speakers, 2 of whom are sharing their paper. One is presenting the paper and the other one is going to answer your questions, dear audience. So I'm going to present those 3 paper presenters or 4 paper presenters in a row. We are then going to listen to all 3 papers, which will be roughly 10 minutes each. And afterwards you have time, or you will get into a discussion with the questions. You are welcome to post in the chat online. So while you are listening to the papers, feel free to already comment or raise questions in the online chat. And I will then present them to our presenters so we can get into a fruitful discussion. So let me start introducing our first speaker, and maybe I should also mention that we changed the order of presentations that you might have seen in a previous program. We are now going to start in chronological order with Anna Knoblauch, who's going to present on the Worms Synagogue. Anna Knoblauch is herself a scientific associate who's working as a researcher and historian with the city of, or the ShUM cities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, or Magenta, as you may know it. She previously earned her master's in heritage conservation studies at the University of Bamberg, and she's working on a PhD project on the Dome of Cologne, the Cathedral of Cologne, on the Peters portal of that same cathedral. I'm very much looking forward to her paper on architecture as a mirror image of society's resilience on the Worms case, going back all those centuries till the 12th century, till the Shoah. And before she starts, however, I'm going to introduce our second co-authored paper and the 2 presenters. The first one is Alma Hannig, who's going to present the paper. She studied medieval and modern history, political sciences, psychology, and Spanish at the universities of Bonn, Bilbao, and Salamanca, so a quite international biography already. She has been teaching research as a research and teaching fellow, worked at different universities, which is very well known to us in academia, and is currently working, among other topics, as an exhibition curator in Vienna, Bonn, and Dresden, and published a few books. I'm not going to cite or quote all the books, but her main research field has been a biography of Franz Ferdinand, and she worked on the Familie Hohenlohe in the 19th and 20th century, so a family, a dynasty biography, so to speak. And she most recently works on anti-Semitism and populism in Austria. And Christopher Brennan, who's gonna answer to your questions mainly, and who co-authored this paper, is from working at the London School of Economics, and he's specialized in the field of Central and East European history, wrote a dissertation on the Sudeten-German problem or questions. He's specialized especially in the interwar period and relations. Again, also Austria and Hungary. That's what brings those 2 researchers together, if I might say so. And he, for example, worked on reforming Austria-Hungary beyond his control or beyond his capacity, the domestic policies of Emperor Karl I. And our third paper is going to be presented by Nathaniel Weston, who is, good morning to you, who's the one who has the whole day ahead of him. And we'll start with the presentation on one of his multiple topics. He's teaching at Seattle Central College in the United States on the Western Coast. And he earned his PhD at the university, or from the University of Washington, so same coast, so to speak. He's currently working on a microhistory of Hugo Bettauer, his legacies and his family. That's also where his paper stems from. His dissertation was on race and nationalism in German colonial anthropologies, a topic that is very current today in German discourse, actually, I must say. Because right now we're discussing a lot about museums collections in Germany, both with their national or nationalist and fascist legacy and their colonial legacy. And all three people are going to present their papers in a row. So the first one is Anna Knoblauch on the synagogue in Worms and architecture as a mirror image of resilience in society. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to speak in German and the discussion is then going to be in English. I'm going to speak about the synagogue in Worms between the 12th century and the Shoah. I ask you to join me in taking a look at the architecture of the ShUM monuments, not from a purely material perspective, but more from the point of view of art and architectural history. After a brief biography of the building history of the Worms synagogue, my aim is to demonstrate that the self-assertion and resilience of the local Jewish community finds particularly clear architectural expression in this structure from the 12th century to the Shoah. The construction of the very first synagogue in Worms was completed in 1034. The founder's inscription next to the north portal indicates that it was made possible by an endowment from Jacob ben David and his wife that same year. The inscription refers to the building as a kleines Heiligtum, or small sanctuary. Unfortunately, little is known about the precise design of that first synagogue. The construction of the second synagogue, the building that would go on to become the focal point of the ShUM communities, was completed in the 12th century. It marked the beginning of the golden age of the Jewish community in Worms, which would last up to the 14th century. In the centuries after that, the building activities of the ShUM communities would increase considerably, and a number of unique monuments would be built not only in Worms but also in Speyer and Mainz. Many of these monuments are still visible today and enjoy a sphere of influence that extends far beyond the ShUM communities themselves. The basic architectural structure and design of the 12th century synagogue in Worms is that of a hall divided into two naves by means of two central pillars marking the building's fundamental east-west axis. This axis comes to an end in the east with the Torah niche and encompasses the raised platform of the Alma at its centermost point between the two pillars. In essence, this architectural axis also traces the liturgical order of events. In the Middle Ages, seating niches and most likely also benches were grouped along the central line and arranged to face the almena. In other words, the synagogue interior clearly created space for community members who were integrated in the context of the liturgical space and whose communication was fostered by that same space. Yet another characteristic of the synagogue's basic structure is the following. By means of its architectural and linguistic metaphors, it transforms key motifs of Solomon's temple, thereby inserting itself into the architectural canon of medieval synagogues. Individual motifs also find contemporary expression in Worms. However, the structural implementation of the Worms synagogue in the 12th century went beyond this to a remarkable degree. By using the two pillars to create a previously unheard of emphasis on the east-west axis between the Torah niche and the Almena, it enabled an allusion to be made to the pillars of Jachin and Boaz in Solomon's temple. On the one hand, this marked an innovation in medieval synagogue architecture, but at the same time it also showed a distinctive delimitation from Christian structures of the era. Indeed, even though the two nave structures built in the Christian environment may appear quite similar, the implementation of this basic structure in the Worms synagogue created the foundation for a schema that transcended space and ritual. That is, a plan that was ideally and uniquely adapted to Jewish liturgy and simply could not have functioned in the Christian context. This innovative architectural structure became exemplary for new synagogues in the entire Ashkenazi world and would go on to be adopted in such cities as Prague, Krakow, Vienna and Budapest. On my last slide, I am going to show you an example from Krakow. The fact that architectural elements belonging to the Worms Synagogue not only correspond to contemporary building forms, but also show a large number of stylistic and technical similarities to neighboring Christian buildings, strongly suggests that the builders of the cathedrals in Speyer and Worms had a considerable influence on the building activities of the ShUM communities, as you see in the slide. However, many individual elements, such as the ornaments on archivolts, capitals, and profiles, were not simply copied mechanically. Instead, they were specifically adapted to fit the particular liturgical and structural purposes of the Jewish community. This allows us to assume with great certainty that Jewish authorities exerted considerable influence on the planning and construction of the Worms Synagogue. Indeed, we can assume that they must have expressly sought to reflect the interests of the Jewish community in the implementation of the architectural designs carried out by Christian builders. Let us now take a look at the exterior of the synagogue. From the very beginning, the synagogue was located at the very center of the Jewish quarter in Worms. Even though Christian authorities never gave any synagogue the right to stand out visually, we know today that these were indeed eye-catching structures amid the urban landscape, even in spite of the ban. For example, the synagogue in Worms, and especially the highly reconstructed and slightly inaccessible synagogue in Speyer, are characterized by several constituent elements on the exterior, the most striking being the position of the windows. In both the Romanesque and Gothic styles of architecture, the gable sides of buildings feature upright rectangular window formats on the sides and a central oculi. The design of the respective window openings is carried out according to the contemporary building trend, as is the case with the tracery windows in Gothic Christian buildings. We are especially familiar with so-called befores from secular architecture, that Romanesque type of window divided vertically into two openings. The exterior appearance of the Worms synagogue causes it to stand out from its surrounding buildings. This characteristic, too, is adopted in the construction of other synagogues throughout the Ashkenazi world. For example, in Maribor, Miltenberg, and Tulln. The persecution of Jews during the pogrom during the plague of 1349 brought an end to the golden age of the ShUM communities and was followed by many difficult decades for the Jewish community. The Worms pogrom of 1615, the citywide fire of 1689, and the occupation of the city by French troops in 1792 caused considerable damage to the structural substance of the Worms synagogue. However, despite the constant displacement, persecution, and material impairment of the Jewish residents of Worms, members of the community always returned to the city following their flight. Not only did they rebuild, repair, and refurbish their destroyed buildings, they also modernized and expanded them, each time giving them a new style more fitting for the times. For example, elements such as the tracery windows and the beamer were adapted to correspond to the latest building fashions and partially rebuilt. Still, the building's essential structure was never changed and was kept in place the whole time. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, the synagogue was again modified and partly adapted to fit changing religious requirements. In 1871, after tensions with the community, a further synagogue was built by Leopold Levi opposite the original synagogue. However, it was the synagogue in place since the 12th century that remained the center of the Jewish community in Worms, and thus a key site of orientation and memory in the Ashkenazi community, right up until 1938. Today, the architectural innovations of the ShUM communities provide us with two key insights. First, we see how leading Jewish community members developed new liturgical concepts of space, and second, that they integrated these new approaches into their planning processes and gave the Christian builders instructions to this effect. In turn, it is obvious that these builders enthusiastically accepted the architectural forms, which were well known at the time, but which had nevertheless been modified. We can therefore assume that there must have been a certain level of joint communication between the two sides, especially in the process of exchanging information and determining the feasibility of the plans. It would also appear that this communication was taken up time and again, even after difficult and highly conflict-ridden times. Instead of abandoning buildings that were destroyed repeatedly over the course of centuries, and rather than simply doing away with old concepts, members of the Jewish community chose to return to their monuments, to strengthen them, to hold fast to traditions, and often even underscore them through innovative modernizations. In doing so, the Jews of Worms demonstrated their resilience and unwavering identification with the historical buildings as well as with the city. Indeed, the synagogue in Worms provides historical evidence of two more things. First, it demonstrates the continuous self-assertiveness of Jews in the diaspora and the ongoing self-chosen identification with Worms as the home of their community. Second, it proves the unique and innovative drive of the Jewish community in Worms and the accompanying noteworthy status, thus making it possible to rightly describe them as the focal point of the ShUM communities and of the Ashkenazi communities in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to sticking to the time perfectly. And I hope that Nate could follow the translation.
Simultaneous translation, so you could understand every word of what Anna presented. And now we're gonna follow suit with the presentation of Alma and Christopher, or to be more precise, Alma, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting conference and for the opportunity to present our paper. And I would like to begin with a quotation from our title. It is from a letter from the highest ranking official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Austria, Alfred Rappaport, who was forced to retire due to his Jewish origin in September 1920. I quote, "I was always proud of the fact that I had a good career in the civil service with this name and in spite of this name, and that it has never hindered me from being honored and decorated by rulers, statesmen, and church dignitaries at home and abroad, without the slightest hurtful allusion to my name. Only in the earliest stage of my career did I have to endure this bitter insult." Yesterday, Sabine Bergler talked about Jews who glorified the Habsburg Empire after the First World War. And this also applies to Rappaport's statement when he ultimately claimed that his Jewish origins did not obstruct his career in the civil service. In the next few minutes, we are going to show that access to the foreign ministry in Austria-Hungary and Germany, especially to the diplomatic corps, was actually denied to Jews. Only a few baptized Jews, like Rappaport himself, made their career in central office or in consular service. Despite the existing extensive research on Jewish history in Germany and Austria, we still lack a systematic treatment of the incorporation of people of Jewish origin into the monarchy's ruling circles. Our thesis is as follows. Despite a few successes regarding the emancipation and integration of Jews in Germany and Austria-Hungary, certain areas remained all but closed to them, particularly in the highest offices of government and in diplomacy. Although the constitutions of the Habsburg and German Empire removed all discriminatory laws and specified that all public offices were open to any citizen of the state, and despite the fact that their foreign offices never imposed confessional quotas, no Jew belonged to the diplomatic corps. While in Prussia, 81% of the diplomats were Protestants, and in the strongly Catholic Habsburg monarchy, 84% were Catholic, 7% Protestants, and 6 Orthodox Christians, only the Jews, who comprised nearly 5% of the people of Austria, lacked representatives in the corps. Very few civil servants and diplomats had partly Jewish descent. What was the reason for that? The foreign offices in Germany and Austria-Hungary were, as one of Germany's leading bourgeois businessmen observed, a club into which one had to be admitted by and through birth. Until the outbreak of the Great War, the diplomatic corps remained primarily a preserve of those with older titles from the higher and highest nobility. This was actually in the tradition of all European great powers, even in France. Aristocrats were considered to be politically reliable. Also, the social factor favored aristocratic aristocrats. In the nobility, fluency in foreign languages, gentility, and charm were taken for granted. And although in Austria many wealthy Jewish families or families of Jewish origins had received patents of nobility, they were never considered unsuitable for diplomacy. According to the ruling circles, bourgeois and new noble families lacked the experience, the sophistication, and the cosmopolitan connections of the old nobility. The attitude of the rulers of both countries is also a key element in seeking to understand this topic, since they were in a position to appoint men directly. Some prominent Jews did indeed enjoy privileged relations with the monarch and were entrusted with important missions. Of these Emperor Jews, Kaiserjuden in Germany, Albert Balin is the most prominent. He was involved in many political decisions and was charged with diplomatic missions, especially negotiating an alliance between Great Britain and Germany. In contrast to the German Emperor Wilhelm II, whose anti-Semitic views are well known, Emperor Franz Joseph was known for his tolerant attitude towards all religions of his subjects and his protective attitude towards the Jews in the Habsburg monarchy. However, his foreign ministers and many other servants in leading positions considered themselves the guardian of traditions, which actually meant the social unacceptability and unsuitability of Jews for diplomacy and the civil service. In Germany, Chancellor Bismarck placed some of his business affairs in the hands of Jews. However, he considered that Jews lacked the necessary inborn refinement and manner so requisite for a diplomat. His son Herbert, who was foreign minister from 1886 to 1890, refused Jews because they were always pushy, stets aufdringlich, and would create dissension in the ranks of their colleagues. The correspondence of many diplomats from Austria-Hungary and Germany is full of tasteless remarks about Jews. Another problem is that even had the foreign offices and the crown had no prejudice against Jews, anti-Semitism at many foreign courts would have made them impossible as envoys. In their central offices in Vienna and Berlin, the foreign ministries were also opposed to appointing Jews. Only 2 unbaptized and 3 baptized Jews can be identified in Berlin. However, 2 of them left their office after a short period of time after experiencing anti-Semitism. In Vienna, only 1 functionary from the central office was a Jew, a few had Jewish backgrounds, and all of them worked mainly in subsidiary positions. Since the consular service made no demands with respect to birth or income, some men who might have preferred a diplomatic career contented themselves with consular positions in distant commercial centers. One of the former consuls of Jewish origins was the above-mentioned Alfred Rappaport, who became advisor to the foreign minister. The example of Berthold Molden might demonstrate how difficult it was for Jews, even converted ones, to get a job in the foreign ministry. Molden was a highly respected journalist and author. From 1913 until 1918, Molden worked on a freelance basis for the foreign ministry in the press bureau, as well as an advisor of the foreign minister. His views corresponded in most points with those of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his advisors. When Molden applied for a regular employment in the foreign ministry, in fact in the archive of the foreign ministry, the new director of the archive, Hans Schlitter, refused him because of his Jewish background. The official explanation was that Schlitter questioned Molden's reliability and discretion because he was a journalist, and later he classified Molden's qualification as insufficient. But the real reason, Schlitter explained to the heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, I quote, "I declared that I only wanted to accept young men who were not only scientifically proficient, but who were also impeccable in character and at the same time either good Austrians or loyal Hungarians. I wished to exclude Jews and Judenstämmlinge, member of the Jewish origins, if only because of the secret files that the state's archives keep." The Archduke praised Schlitter's judgment. It's hardly surprising because he was also known for his anti-Semitic attitude that he agreed with Schlitter on all points. However, in the last years of the monarchy, 10% of the diplomats had some Jewish roots in their maternal ancestry, and all of them were from old noble families and converted to Christianity. Interestingly enough, the absence of confessing Jews in the service did little to dispel the many rumors that the Corps was populated by Jews or that sinister Jewish machinations controlled Austro-Hungarian and German diplomacy. Politically, despite the Jews' emancipation in the Habsburg Empire, their appointment to ministerial posts occurred only in the penultimate year of the war, at the time when the dual monarchy was mostly likely beyond salvation. Moreover, the first occurred in Hungary, not in Austria. Emperor Karl, who had inherited some of the prejudices of his uncle Franz Ferdinand and occasionally make the crass anti-Semitic comments usual for the time but hardly befitting a Habsburg ruler, was astonished by these appointments in Hungary. In June 1917, he told German General Hans von Seeckt of his concern about having sworn in Vilmos Vázsony, a Jew, as Hungarian Minister of Justice on the Virgin Mary and Saint Stephen. Vázsony became the first professing Jewish minister in Hungary in the short-lived cabinet of Moritz Esterházy. Esterházy was replaced by the veteran Sándor Vekele, who had been the first non-noble prime minister of Hungary. And after several reshuffles, the cabinet contained 3 Jews by the beginning of the following year, leading Count Leopold Berchtold to note in his diary in January 1918, I quote, "The emperor finds the presence of 3 Hebrews in the cabinet not very pleasing, but says that, since they are accompanied by 7 respectable men, the percentage is not so bad after all." When the game was up and Karl finally appointed the reformist maverick Mihály Károly as prime minister on 27th of October 1918, the latter, who thought Karl anti-Semitic, noted that when Karl nominated him, he was so gloomy and exhausted that he'd not even ask if his future ministers were to be Jews or not, a question he rarely failed to put. This attitude likely explains Karl's attitude in Austria, where he was more actively involved in domestic politics. When Karl was desperately seeking a prime minister to reform the country in early July 1917, many suggested the distinguished Jewish jurist and parliamentarian Josef Redlich to him as the ideal candidate for a democratic cabinet of national unity. Redlich, a respected Anglophile who was a member of the German National Union of Deputies, was summoned to Baden to talk to the emperor, where, during a long, productive conversation, both seemed to be in agreement on both the issues undermining Austria and on the necessary solutions. Impressed, Karl asked him the following day if he would take on the job. Redlich agreed in principle, yet the matter dragged on due to Karl's indecision and to the various other recommendations and warnings. Finally, Karl chose the non-political bureaucrat Ernst Seidler as prime minister, eschewing the bolder and more radical choices and indeed the Jewish choice. A year later, in June 1918, Johann von Klumetzky told Redlich that he had once again mentioned him to Karl as a man who could provide a great deal of help to Austria in these difficult times. Incredibly, Karl responded, I quote, "I know him, he was at mine, but tell me, he is a sugar industrialist, is he not? And is he completely reliable?" I don't have to mention that it was an anti-Semitic code. Finally, long after the 11th hour, on 27th of October 1918, Redlich was appointed finance minister for 2 weeks in the Lammasch cabinet, whose sole mission was to liquidate the monarchy. Redlich was thus the first and last Jewish minister in Imperial Austria. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much, Alma and Christopher, for this paper. And I just want to briefly mention that I worked, my dissertation was on Jewish student fraternities in Weimar and Imperial Germany, and of course also briefly on Austrian Jewish student fraternities, and this prejudice of those Jews not being loyal and being too pushy, especially, was something that is very familiar to that history also, because as soon as they try to be part of something that everyone was, they were considered as being too pushy. So thank you for this, but let's not start discussing yet, sorry. And let's move on to our third paper and presenter, Nate Weston, on sharing Vienna in Hugo Bettauer's The City Without Jews. So Nate, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. So this novel was originally published in 1922 in Vienna. And the basic story is that a law is passed expelling Jewish people from Austria. And the result is that the city and the country falls apart. It is economically devastated, and cultural life is also ruined. And so what the authorities are forced to do is invite the Jewish people back to save Austria. And so what this implies is that the Jewish and non-Jewish Austrians need one another. And so this is this kind of notion, the author is putting forward this notion that sharing is essential, sharing Vienna and sharing Austria. We can't undo what's been going on. And so I'll just sort of briefly summarize it. And it's satirical, which seems sort of strange to us now, but it's really set in this post-World War I era. I think we just heard that, you know, there's a kind of rising anti-Semitism. I think that the defeat probably contributes to that, as well as the economic. There's always an economic component, it seems, to anti-Semitism as well. So it's written in response. It's a very short novel. It's melodramatic, but it's written in response to this anti-Semitism. So it adopts anti-Semitism in a sense and plays it out to show how irrational and ineffective and ultimately impossible it is. And obviously that's a stance that doesn't quite hold. It continues to appeal, obviously, today for whatever reason. So this law is passed, and it visits just different sectors in Austrian society in which Jewish and non-Jewish people coexist. Journalism is one. And so they begin to divide in anticipation of the passage of this law. When the law is passed, the Austrian chancellor argues that, well, we can't have Jewish people in our society because they're just too powerful, right? This is an anti-Semitic discourse that the Jews are dominating us, right? Which I think is actually, in a sense, an interesting form of racism, right? To say that the group is too powerful, and in a sense it implies that the non-Jewish group is being victimized and is weaker. So again, it's a satire. So the author is playing on this idea of, you know, well, what if we took anti-Semitism seriously? What if we sort of, you know, carried out the ideas that it is proposing? So the law is passed, and immediately a member of parliament realizes, oh no, this is going to affect my family. His daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchildren have to leave the country. He's passed this law. He's been responsible for passing this law. And it turns out that his son-in-law had converted to Christianity. And so families and faiths had been shared, Bettauer is showing, but now anti-Semitism is kind of trying to divide these arenas. Jewish people, meanwhile, in Vienna are trying to figure out, well, you know, now where are we going to go? And so they're thinking about, okay, I'm going to go to Paris, I'm going to go to Berlin, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and there's just this kind of conversation about it. There's just interesting kind of episodes in which an actor who had been celebrated as the embodiment of beauty among Christians actually turns out to be Jewish, while a guy who's sort of stereotypically Jewish, he has crooked legs and his face has a pronounced Jewish aspect. He's allowed to stay because his grandfather had converted to Christianity. So Bettauer is kind of twisting racial stereotypes, even though he uses racial stereotypes, but to show that they ultimately don't stand up. Christian women who have Jewish boyfriends are very sad because they're going to lose their boyfriends who gave them so many gifts. And then certain Christian youths protest this law, and then they convert to Judaism. So there's all these, I think, satirical elements. The chancellor has to go into isolation because he's just been so stressed out by this entire endeavor of passing this law. But the law hasn't gone the way that he had hoped. The economy didn't improve right away, and it's just taking a whole lot longer to expel the Jewish people than he expected, right? So it's kind of, it doesn't work out. Even the Archbishop of Austria, his sister and brother had both been married to Jewish people, and so they have to leave. So the Archbishop is all alone. So it's key to think about personal relationships in the novel. That's what the author kind of depends upon. The main character is a Jewish convert, and he has a Christian girlfriend, so just that kind of intimate relationship is central. He had served with his girlfriend's brother in World War I, and the brother died in his arms. And so when he's expelled, he vows to come back to the country as soon as possible. The last Jewish people are exiled on Christmas Day. And the author's doing this to kind of call out Christianity and basically say, like, well, you know, is this loving thy brother? And so I read a quote here just because I think it feels like an omen. When we think about it today, it feels, you know, it's just like, wow, he's really predicting, you know, what happens 20 years later. With the use of all means of transport, with the help of locomotives that were borrowed from neighboring states, with the cessation of every other passenger and freight transport, the last Jews were taken away in 30 gigantic trains. And then the non-Jewish population celebrates. So as explained earlier, the economy just falls into ruin. The culture has just become completely dull, uninteresting, provincialized. And the main character's girlfriend, her father states that people would soon see that the Jews and the Christians in this country complemented each other very well. Fashion dies out, the city becomes overrun by peasants. And this main character returns disguised as a Frenchman. And so it's another twist on kind of, you know, racial characteristics, that somehow he can be easily disguised as a Frenchman. All he has to do is grow a goatee. And then he comes back and he undermines the anti-Jewish law. And so they pass a law which invites back the Jewish exiles. And now the non-Jewish population rejoice. The novel was really popular. It sold 250,000 copies initially, and it was translated into Polish, Hungarian, English, French, Dutch, and Ladino. And it became a film. The film has actually just recently been restored. I don't know if people knew about that. The author's important for the novel, but also because he launched what he called the Erotic Revolution in a magazine he published entitled und Sie, and it came out in February 1924. He actually got put on trial for this, for public indecency, but was found not guilty. And during the trial, he was savagely attacked on anti-Semitic grounds. And so coupling his, you know, advocacy of open sexuality with his Jewish ancestry began to be this pattern that gets followed just by anti-Semites in the next year. So his first magazine, he stops publishing it and he comes out with a new one, and he still is promoting free sexuality, and he has support among youth and women and the working class, but the right wing is completely against him. And ultimately he's murdered in Vienna in March of 1925 by a National Socialist. The Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg wrote an article about him and his writing and called the novel City Without Jews, Jewish Race Propaganda. The historian Roman Tüppel shows that Rosenberg's article actually profoundly influenced Hitler's thinking about race mixing, specifically in the chapter of Mein Kampf entitled Volk und Rasse. Another work came out discussing Bettauer and his ethnic origin as a Jewish person, as well as his advocacy of free sexuality. It was called Erotic und Rasse, and it was a book-length attack on Bettauer, and it got ultimately serialized in a Viennese anti-Semitic newspaper. The historian Jeffrey Giles points out that Erotic Revolution was read by Himmler. And so just in the early days of the Nazi Party, apparently the example of Bettauer, the Bettauer case, it was called Der Fall Bettauer, sort of, inspired or provoked the anti-Semitism of the early Nazis. So I think that it's interesting that it's a satire, it's conceived of as a satire, because I think that sort of underestimates, and I think that was part of the power of the anti-Semitic movement and the Nazi movement, is that people underestimated it. And obviously it gains strength. And his murder, I think, represents a kind of turning point, that one, they're going to turn to violence, but two, that they ultimately have more support than people expect. And I think that Bettauer shows them to be sort of stupid. And in fact, if we imagine racism today, we think, about all the inconsistencies of it, it still has force. In spite of it being irrational, it still has a kind of force. So writers continue to discuss Bettauer, anti-Semitic writers. He appears in the Der ewige Jude exhibition, which begins in Munich and comes to Vienna and ultimately ends in Berlin. Different writers, including the assassin himself, write articles in Vienna using the idea of the city without Jews as Nazi policy. They say, well, yeah, exactly. We want Vienna to be a city without Jews. We want all these cities to be cities without Jews. Of course, they're not reading the novel properly and realizing that it ends with this triumphant return and inviting back of the Jewish people. After World War II, sort of everything to do with Bettauer kind of disappears. Some historians begin to rediscover him and literary critics, but it kind of takes time. I think that his advocacy of sexual freedom is repressed a little bit in the post-war period. But by 2002, the city of Vienna has now put up a memorial plaque dedicated to him, discussing his life and his work. The film, as I had stated earlier, is rediscovered in 2018 and put out again. And then an exhibition is held by the Film Archive of Austria that connects not just the city without Jews, but it connects it to other groups who are alienated and excluded from society, Muslims and refugees and foreigners. The exhibition itself had become the target of an anti-Semitic attack. And so they took photos of the attack. They wrote these swastikas on advertisements for the event. They took pictures of it and put it inside the exhibition. So I liked that they incorporated it. So I think this is still a stance that Vienna takes and thinks about itself. So they sort of identify with Hugo Bettauer. So it shows that this initial kind of multicultural embrace, we have to share, now is a kind of standard among many people in Vienna today. What happened to Bettauer's family? One son escaped to the United States.
We are running out of time.
Okay. That's we don't need to have the bracketed section here. That's perfect. Thank you. I wasn't keeping my eye on the clock. I was too busy with trying to keep track of all of the technologies otherwise. Thank you. I think that's perfect. I appreciate this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. No, actually, I know exactly what you mean. Keeping track. So so thank you very much, Nate, and thank you all speakers of this panel. And dear audience, first of all, we are running a bit late because we had technical issues at the beginning. So we started a bit late, and then I must admit, me too, I'm struggling with those different screens and paper, and but at least we can have this conference. So it's better than not having it at all. And for those of you who want to add remarks, questions to our speakers, please feel free to do so in the chat. And first, while you're typing your questions and remarks into the chat, we can start discussing within our panel. So you raised your Christopher.
In English. Well, I just wanted to ask Anna about the synagogue. I remember many years ago seeing it and being told that it had been completely ravaged during Kristallnacht. I just wanted to know who organized the reconstruction, when, and how many original stones and elements from the synagogue were saved from Kristallnacht or hidden away and were used in the rebuilding?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I left out the whole history after the Shoah because it's a complete new period of the history. So to say, we have some historians that got in touch with politicians from Worms, and they had lots of discussion which kind of the architectural design and which forms shall be reconstructed and which not. So Isidor Kiefer, for example, let rebuild the Roman portal that I showed in my presentation right before the rebuilding started during the 1950s. And so to say, we have around about 10 or 20% original stones that were reconstructed or that were taken from the construction site to build a new synagogue or the reconstructed synagogue, and they also used the original pillars or the original chapitals to rebuild the new ones. So they had original they had the original to build the copies. So everything was really, yeah, I would say really strict looking to history. But yeah, there are also so many things we can discuss about the reconstruction, I think.
But there was original material that had been saved.
Yes.
Was it stored somewhere in the wall? Was it hidden, or was it left as a ruin?
Sometimes it had been hidden right in the floor or in the fundaments of the building, and I can imagine when you saw the portal, it was kind of just destroyed and laid around in the construction site, and they put it on again. But you can find also some original parts in the museum today. They are restored and, yeah, keeping up there.
Thank you.
Are there more questions within class, the new speakers? If not at the moment, then I have two questions from the audience. Sorry. So one is also to Anna. It's in German, so this is the minute for applause for our interpreters who are going to try to interpret, to silently translate it into English while I'm going to read it in German to you. Sie haben in Ihrem schönen Vortrag eine Verbindung zwischen der Wormser Synagoge und der Synagoge
You made a
in
link between the Synagogue of Worms and Krakow, Prague. And on the path you have Regensburg, a city with a very old and significant Jewish community of that time. Eisdorfer draw it before it was destructed in 1519. Would you say that this is also one of the line of this tradition? This is a very interesting question, yes, but I can answer in English.
Question. I think it belongs to this kind of line between Krakow and Budapest, for example. But I think it's a kind of I don't know how to say it right now.
So say it in German and we can translate it. It's not the language.
Ja, Entschuldigung. Es ist die,
well, yes, it is a continuation, I would say. Of course, it is a part of this line, but in Regensburg there was a further development which came originally from the ShUM Cities and was continued.
Thank you. So I have two more questions now to Nate. One is about the historical knowledge of Hugo Bettauer. To us, it seems a foreseeing book, but the same story happened when the Jews were expelled by Leopold I from Vienna in 1670 and asked 3 years later to come back because of the lacking money. Do you know by chance if Bettauer correlates with that story? And the other question also to Nate is did I read on your briefly shown slide that you are a grandson of Bettauer? Nate, are you there? Yes, there you are.
Yes. So I'll answer these at the same time. No, I'll start with the exile question, which I think it's absolutely about the exile. But we today, because we live, we think about the Holocaust, we read the book as prophetic of the Holocaust, and I don't think it's prophetic of the Holocaust because, of course, there isn't this sort of reconciliation at the end, right? This, oh, well, we learned that we did the wrong thing, and so we need to invite the people back. No, that's why it's set in this post-World War I period, which is looking back at the past, at all of these episodes of exclusion and exile. And so I think he's reading these anti-Semitic calls right after World War I. No, I was trying to sneak in there that indeed I am the grandson of Hugo Bettauer. So it's just a family history. No, that's another, I think, dimension that's part of it, because both of his sons, sort of lived through the Nazi takeover of Austria in different ways. Firstly, my grandfather escaped right after the Anschluss, and then his brother actually stayed and is murdered in Auschwitz. We never knew this. My grandfather never told anyone. So I think that it's interesting when we think about like Holocaust memory, that sometimes people don't want to remember, that there's an active attempt to sort of forget all that. Okay, we're in the United States now. And in fact, they didn't ever talk about our Jewish ancestry either, right? So there's this funny erasing of the past. And I rediscovered, his name is Helmut Bettauer, rediscovered that he was murdered in Auschwitz in 2009. So it's just one of those peculiar situations. I think every episode I think is different, and that's why I think microhistories are an interesting way to study the Holocaust, and I mean to really study history in general, because you find out that these individual cases just really show you something unique.
Could I have
Thank you very much. Actually, you just answered the question of one of our members of the audience, but Chris, you also had another question?
Yes, just for Nate. I came across Bettauer by pure chance, walking down the street where he was murdered, and there is a plaque on Langergasse in Vienna. And so the book came out in 22, and from what I gather, it was a huge success. It sold tens, if not hundreds of thousands of copies. And he was murdered in 25. To what extent was he aware that his life was in danger? To what extent was he threatened by early National Socialists? Did he have any protection against himself, or was he just happy to walk down the street? Did he feel safe? I mean, was this a man in danger, under threat, who would have required protection by that time?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think he should have been aware, and he wasn't, right? I mean, we always have hindsight, and so we can think about, why didn't the person have security? When he's on trial for the publication of und Sie, there's these violent calls in the press. One writer talks about, we need to apply lynch justice, right? Because he's acquitted for public indecency, right? And so lynch justice is this notion of like, well, we're going to take the law into our own hands. So I think he should have been more careful. I have no idea how aware he was. He obviously keeps publishing this. The assassin just marches right into his office and kills him. He had sort of held office hours. It's almost like he had office hours if people wanted to come discuss with him. Ultimately, any issues to do with sexuality, he would discuss with him. He would sort of counsel them. He was a real advocate of Freud, but on a popular level, I don't think that he was getting into, just the deep theories. It was just much more about just like, well, no, we need to kind of think about sexuality and realize that this is the root of many people's problems. So I think it's horribly naive. I mean, I think we would imagine it as really naive. I think he was in danger, but I think that sometimes that people don't heed the situation as they should. And I mean, what would his security apparatus look like? I mean, I'm not sure, it's hard to say.
But surely the film that came out the year before would have reignited the debate and reignited the passions. So even though it was 3 years since the book had been published, it had only been the year before that the film, which was also a success, had been shown. So therefore, he must have been one of the most controversial, loved, hated, significant people of the time. And you're quite right. I have no idea what the security detail would have been like. Who would have done it? The city, private. It's unimaginable. I think the plaque actually talks about him as being the first victim of Nazism in Austria. So I have no idea what the security would have been like. It would have had to be in his own initiative, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry that I have to wrap up this panel, but I have one last question, which is always nice to end a panel with an offer to the audience that brings us into what can we do next. And we have this very concrete last question here in our forum, which is, where is the film available? Is it the National Institute of Jewish Film or whatever it's called, or where can you see it?
That's a good question. I mean, I would look through the Film Archive of Austria. I don't know if they produced commercially, but I believe. I mean, I think, you know, just always let's steal everything for free on YouTube. I think there's a version on YouTube, but I think it's a Spanish language, so you'll have to study your Spanish and then you can watch it. But it might have the German intertitles. Might have German
on DVD.
It's available on DVD.
You can just go onto Amazon.de and as I did, and you can buy it for 12 euros. That's the easiest way to do it.
That's okay. So now you know where you get the film. Whoever asked the question, or
nice
also
new edition.
my colleagues here on the panel.
Yeah.
So I thank everyone for discussing, for asking questions, for staying in their time limits. And before you, dear audience, go onto Amazon or YouTube to watch whatever movie you would like, I invite you to join the next panel that's going to start in half an hour and is going to discuss shared spheres and cultural exchange, acceptance as challenge and opportunity. But before you zoom out, thank you all, dear panelists and the technical staff in the background, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.